All right, good evening, everybody. As Rebecca said, my name is Jeff McCauley. And before I get started, can everyone see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, there we go. So, first topic I'd like to discuss is why a nonprofit would utilize volunteers. There's several reasons. The expansion of the mission. So, every nonprofit in its incorporation is fulfilling a need that the community needs that the government entity can't necessarily get to. So there's always an important mission that a nonprofit is trying to accomplish. And when you're trying to go and out in the community and get volunteers, volunteers often carry the message of the organization's mission of which they're working for and volunteering for. So recruiting additional volunteers or recruiting volunteers is a great way to expand the mission and mission advocacy of a nonprofit in the community. Additionally, most volunteers that work with an organization also tend to become donors and or members of the organization. So that also increases revenue to your nonprofit through increased communities support. So if you're thinking of where you need to find volunteers, there are many different areas to find volunteers, and it really depends on the needs that your nonprofit has in terms of what type of volunteer group you would want to look for. So there are numerous ways to go about it through the organization's social media, newsletter, or website is a great way to reach individual specific volunteers for specific projects or for specific ongoing tasks that need to be done. And this is a great way to utilize the branding and marketing that the nonprofit currently has. And oftentimes this is a great way to get specific volunteers who are interested in a very specific way to help the nonprofit through their skill set that they've acquired through either volunteering at other organizations or oftentimes through their professional development throughout their life. The other ways of which to look for partnerships are through partnership nonprofits such as Pittsburgh Cares. If you're not familiar, Pittsburgh Cares is also a nonprofit here based in Pittsburgh, and they allow it both. Uh, they connect corporate groups with nonprofits and volunteers from corporations and other large institutions in and around the city. And they try to match up the skill set of the individuals that want to volunteer with the organizations that are in need of volunteers. Additional ways to find other volunteers would be most of the universities in the city have volunteer fairs and events. It's a great way to go find student interns at most of the major universities, the University of Pittsburgh, the University of Duquesne. They both have very prominent volunteer fairs and events. And oftentimes you can find interested students and or groups of students to facilitate your volunteer needs. When I worked at Friends of the Riverfront, I sought out both fraternity and sorority community group leaders in order to keep their status current with the university and the community. Most fraternities and sororities had to volunteer so many hours in a semester. And it worked out well because when I was at Friends of the Riverfront, I could handle 30, 40, 50 volunteers at a time for a 3 hour event. And so that made it very convenient for the organizations to send me a large group of students. And I would be able to utilize their skill set for a riverfront stewardship event all at one time. And then also, the most large corporations in the city of Pittsburgh and the surrounding area have community engagement directors, or someone whose responsibility at the company is to connect interested workers in the company with interested nonprofits that are in need of volunteers. And I've been fortunate enough to work with many different types of corporations throughout my time, such as uh, Columbia Gas, Duquesne Light, BNY Mellon, just to name a few. So if you're able to get connected with these businesses and corporations in town, oftentimes they will be able to provide you volunteers for a specific amount of time or a specific day. Most of the corporations, they do provide their employees a certain amount of time to actually get paid volunteer time throughout the year. So these employees are motivated to go out and help organizations. Um, and then once you get a volunteer, it's important to make sure that the volunteer who is doing the specific task for your organization remains happy, because uh, even though I have worked with many volunteers in my time, one of the uh, sayings that I always told people, if I didn't treat them well, or I didn't treat them right, or I wasn't professional in my job, eventually I would run out of first time volunteers, even though we do live in a large city. Um, at some point, if you don't treat people well, you'll run out of volunteers. And so you'll see these five ways to make a volunteer uh, more likely to keep volunteering with your organization. Um, if you make them feel valued and tell them that you appreciate their work, that you believe, you know, their work is moving the organization in a positive direction, that their work is being really valued, and it's really helping to fill in some strategic gaps that staff of the organization don't necessarily have time to get to, and that it's a big help. Uh, if you also, if they work on a large project and you're able to share the results of the work that they do, if they work on a project that helps you get a large grant, you should convey that, that said volunteers' efforts help give you the ability to get this large grant to really move the organization forward. Um, and then, you know, always be professional with the volunteers. If you ask them to be at a certain place at a certain time, or if you need them to do a certain thing, make sure that you have all the supplies that are needed for the volunteers to accomplish their task. Make sure that if you need to meet them somewhere or provide them a certain amount of supplies to do their task, that everything's there ready for them. And then the last important point would be that whatever tasks you're giving a volunteer, if it fits the skill set that they either have or they want to try to learn, that I have found that that's the best way to cultivate volunteers to come back. Sometimes when you ask volunteers to do things that they're not necessarily great at, or they don't want to necessarily try to learn to be good at, it discourages them and causes them to be less likely to come back and help your organization, because they're uncomfortable, they're concerned that they're not doing something right, and it makes them more likely to perhaps go volunteer with a different organization. So, for groups of individuals, it's also important, when I planned events for 30, 40, 50 people, either from a large corporation or from a university, I always made sure to develop relationships with the individual that was the point of contact from the business or the university. Most of the time, because the point of contact wouldn't necessarily change, but perhaps some of the volunteers would be one group, one department, 1 week, or a different set of students every year if you're looking at it from a university's perspective. So it's always important to develop great relationships with the point of contacts, uh, both at universities for student engagement directors and at corporations. That way, uh, you have you have a positive. They have you have the director at the corporation has a positive view of you and your organization, and then as they would like to have volunteers out in the community, they'll be more likely to remember you in the future. Again, being professional. If you schedule a volunteer event, make sure you're there early. You have everything set up that you need to have and be ready to go. Um, One of the biggest turnoffs I've heard from volunteers over the years is that they'll show up for organization X, and when they show up, they are ready to go. They want to get right to work or get introduced to the project that they wanted are supposed to do. And if there's a lot of dead time and a lot of downtime because you're still setting things up and you're still getting ready for the event, uh, doesn't reflect well, and so that also would cause them to uh, hold a negative opinion of you, and that could hurt you down the line when you try to go back to and get repeat volunteers from these corporations, universities, and other locations. Um, and then the third point, when you have your volunteer event or initiative planned out, I've also heard from numerous volunteers over the years that they would show up to volunteer a specific organization and they would have certain tasks to do, but they would be so efficient at completing those tasks that they would finish early and then kind of stand around and wonder what's next. And the leader of the organization managing the volunteers did not have subsequent projects for volunteers to work on. So, I've learned that volunteers like to work at a good pace so they can accomplish a project, but typically if they accomplish something early and they're able to still have time allotted, they would really want to take on another project, or at least start another project that you have available for them to do. So, when I worked with large groups, I always have backup plans available in my mind of, well, if we finish this as a group early, I have, 2 or 3 other things that we can do with the group. So no one feels that, well, I just have to kill time until I'm able to leave, or I'm just going to leave early. And the volunteer doesn't feel like they contributed as much as they could when they showed up for this event. And then finally, showing gratitude for work. I always try to, in a volunteer group setting, to talk with some of the volunteers while doing work with them to, understand how they learned about the volunteer opportunity that you're working with today, because that can help lead you to additional marketing opportunities in terms of volunteer recruitment. Um, and then, make sure that you try to thank them on an individual basis while you're doing some of the tasks with them, because everyone likes to be thanked for their hard efforts and time that they're putting into this cause. And it goes a long way into relationship building, which is the underlying basis of good volunteer recruitment, is developing relationships with volunteers. Couple things about volunteering from just an organizational standpoint. Again, carrying the theme through of being professional and providing all the supplies needed for tasks. One of the things that may go overlooked, but I think is also important to recognize, is insurance needs for volunteers. If you have volunteers doing certain tasks and they happen to damage their car, if you're if they're moving certain items, or they happen to get hurt while doing uh, a specific task for you. Typically most nonprofits have a volunteer liability waiver that gets signed to remove liability from the organization. But it is a nice gesture if someone does get hurt, that if they get stung by, since Hollow Oak Land Trust is an outdoor organization, some of our lead land stewards who have, they've gotten stung by a bee or something of that nature throughout their volunteer efforts, Hollow Oak makes the effort to try to pay the deductible if they have to go see the doctor, just because they were out there doing something for us, and they wouldn't have been subjected to those issues if they weren't out there at that time for the purpose of helping us. So those are some um, additional thoughts to think about when working with volunteers on a regular basis that uh, become kind of ingrained in the organization, are always able to help you. I think it's also important to remember those. And then, carrying the theme through again, having meaningful tasks for the volunteers to accomplish, it makes them feel important to the organization, and they get to see the quality and value of their work actually pay off to move the organization's mission forward. And then some additional ways to express value to volunteers, recognition and awards. You know, at Friends of the Riverfront, I had a trail steward group of 8 individuals. Um, you know, Instead of having a large event every year to just for those individuals who volunteered the most throughout the year for us, it actually worked out from a cost perspective to take them to dinner at various restaurants, like various pizza restaurants or burger places around the city. And it worked for them because you know we communicated a lot via email, but I also found that they really appreciated FaceTime to discuss issues they were seeing on the trail, or other issues related to trail stewardship. And they really got a lot out of the thank you of treating them to dinner once a month, and the FaceTime that they had to be able to talk with me. Um, there's also, personal thank you cards and gifts. Oftentimes right now, at Hollow Oak Land Trust, at our annual dinner, we have our Volunteer of the Year, and we typically get the Volunteer of the Year a gift card to a bike shop or an outdoor outfitter, so they can get something new for um, themselves, because they did donate so much time and so much effort to the organization. And then the last way you could thank individuals is through organizational perks of free memberships to the organization, free entrance to events. Um, all of those can be organizationally based, depending on what your memberships entail, or what events that you have that would be great for volunteers to attend, and that you feel that the volunteers would get a great experience from attending. So with that, if there's any questions and comments, let me look at my bar.
Jeff, I think we can move on over to Braden's presentation.
Yes, I think so. I guess I should start.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me just share my screen here. And can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. thank you, everybody. I appreciate you joining us this evening. Tonight, the portion that I am going to cover for this webinar is effectively communicating with the public. So I do a lot of communicating with the public. As Rebecca mentioned, I worked for the National Park Service for 5 years at Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. There I was a frontline interpretive ranger, so greeting visitors every day at the visitor center, doing interpretive programs, whether they were, sort of more informal meetups on the front porch of the visitor center that might last 10 or 15 minutes to half an hour scripted guided hikes that we all did exactly the same down the boardwalk to Dingman's Falls, or even some longer things where we'd be taking groups out for the day on a 5 to 7 mile hike for 3 or 4 hours. And just doing stops and interpretation along the way about the resources that we came across. So when I think about communicating with the public, it's not just speaking to the public and providing them directions or providing them instructions, but as resource managers, we are oftentimes trying to convey messages to get people interested and inspired to help us manage our resources. Oftentimes as a park ranger, I'm working with the public to sometimes communicate these messages to help them stop doing an activity in our parks that they're doing that they shouldn't be doing. So there's a lot of different ways that we're communicating with the public when we're working with parks, in natural resources, and on public lands. So what I'm going to focus on today is utilizing interpretation to effectively communicate with the public about natural resources, natural resource protection, and natural resource management strategies. So often, the famous character, the Lorax, we are the ones that are speaking for the trees and helping them tell their story to a public who might not quite understand it. So to start out, I'm not going to assume that everyone here knows what a natural resource is. And that's an important thing with communicating with the public is we should never assume that people know things. So what are natural resources? A natural resource is anything that we take from the natural environment that we use. So that might be water, wood, wind energy, solar energy, coal, natural gas, wild animals even, minerals, and metals. So anything that we find out there in nature. And we really break it down into renewable and non-renewable resources. So when speaking about things like wood, where we can harvest forests for wood to build things, we can plant them again and allow them to regrow and regenerate and create a renewable resource. And things like oil, natural gas really aren't, over millions of years can be renewable, but really in the human perspective aren't a renewable resource. Or like gold, there's only so much out there that exists right now. So that's kind of the basic idea of natural resources. And as I mentioned, communication with the public, the main thing that I'm going to focus on is a type of communication that is interpretation. As a park ranger in the National Park Service and for Allegheny County, I use interpretation to communicate with the public all of the time, no matter what the setting is, whether it's a formal setting or whether it's just meeting someone on the trail. So what is interpretation? Interpretation is communicating with the public, but creating an emotional and intellectual connection for the audience. So we're using facts about natural resources or cultural resources or recreational resources, all the things that are involved in our parks, but we're not just presenting facts directly to the folks that we meet and just hitting them with nonstop numbers and stats and data and information. That's not interpretation. Interpretation uses that information, uses that data and the facts that we have about our natural resources, and it puts them in a simplistic way. It doesn't dumb them down, but it distills them into something that the public can consume. So people that are not professionals in the industry, the general public who are probably professionals in something else and know much more about their specialties than we do, and takes our specialty and gives it to them in a way that they can easily understand. with a goal of not just instructing them and giving them more facts and information, but with provoking them. And really provoking them is what interpretation is all about. It's getting people the information that we want them to have, and then driving them to either find more information or take action afterwards. And so as we go through my presentation today, we're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to talk about what interpretation is, the difference between interpretation and education, give you the basic theories about interpretation, the fundamentals of developing an interpretive talk or a program, whether it be formal or informal. And then just kind of break down the key concepts of what you want to do with interpretation and what you don't want to do with interpretation. So why do we interpret natural resources? There's really a variety of reasons, and it's all going to depend on what the message is that you're trying to drive home. Whether you're a park ranger, whether you're a watershed steward, whether you're a volunteer at a nature center, you might be a school teacher, you might be a babysitter perhaps, who knows? But you may need to find yourself interpreting natural resources. So to start out, let's break down the core definition of education versus interpretation, because a lot of people, I think, kind of get hung up on the idea that education and interpretation are really the same thing. But really, interpretation uses education, and education can also use interpretation, but they're solely two different things. Just the straight definition of education is a process of facilitating learning, or the acquisition of knowledge, skills, values, beliefs, and habits. Educational methods can include teaching, training, storytelling, discussion, directed research. And kind of the thing that I want to key in on is the last statement here. In most regions, education is compulsory up to a certain age. So what that means is you're forced to partake in the education, whether you're going to grade school, middle school, high school. It's something that you're expected to do and expected to learn. Now, interpretation is an approach to communication. It involves translating technical language of a natural science or related field into terms and ideas that people who aren't scientists can readily understand. So I think the big difference between education and interpretation is that education is providing facts, providing knowledge, providing skills and ideas to people so that they can then take that and utilize that in their life. Now, interpretation can do the same thing, but interpretation is really a way of kind of taking the educational components of it, taking the mastery of a skill and breaking it down. So oftentimes in education, an educator is the professional, the doctor, speaking to people who are going to further themselves. They may be looking to gain a bachelor's degree or graduate high school or get a master's degree or get a doctorate degree. They're kind of interested oftentimes in that field. Interpretation is being someone who has a mastery or the knowledge of the message and the resource that we're trying to inspire other people to be interested in speaking to people who may have no previous knowledge, no background, maybe a little bit of interest, but maybe no interest in all in what we're talking about. We're trying to take those complicated ideas, break them down, and provide them into bite-sized pieces to folks with a message that inspires them and, again, provokes them. So I want to take the words from a very famous interpreter, Freeman Tilden, and try and inspire you a little bit as we start on our journey to learn really what interpretation is and how we can utilize it. So Freeman Tilden, he was born in 1883. He was the son of a newspaper owner, and he worked and wrote for his father's newspaper. He worked and wrote for some other larger city newspapers for a while, was a playwright, but he was really fascinated with the outdoors and the National Park Service and wrote books about them, and was fascinated about interpretation and interpreting natural resources. And his book, Interpreting Our Heritage, is really the cornerstone of what interpretation means and interpretation theory. And the National Park Service uses that to teach interpreters what the theory of interpretation is, and they use it in all of their trainings. And one of the things that I took for the most value of Tilden's approach to interpretation is probably one of his most famous quotes. So I want to read you this, and I want you to think about it, and then we're going to go through and break it down, and it really defines exactly what interpretation is and how we use interpretation to protect and conserve natural resources. So Tilden wrote, through interpretation, understanding. Through understanding, appreciation. Through appreciation, protection. So what does that mean? Through interpretation, understanding. The act and the art, the idea of interpretation is the catalyst for what we're trying to achieve. The interpreter answers questions, removes fear of the unknown, and creates a connection to a resource or idea that could easily be understood. Now, true interpretation doesn't just give a one-sided view of an idea, but it provides a full scope of the topic and lets the audience decide their viewpoint on the topic. And I think that's a really big core chunk of the one of the differences between interpretation and education. It's an area where a young interpreter or someone who's not familiar with communicating these ideas to the public gets a little bit tripped up. Interpretation is not bashing people over the head with an idea that we believe is the correct idea. It's presenting them with all of the facts, all of the concepts, both sides of the story, and allowing our presentation to be compelling enough that the individual listening to us can really come up with their own conclusion. And we hope that if we've done a good enough job, the conclusion that we're kind of directing them to. So we provide people with an understanding of complex ideas in a way that when they really get a good grasp for them, they can appreciate them. I love this picture on this screen because this boy here is looking up close and personal with this gray tree frog. And you can tell that at some point somebody taught him about frogs, and he's kind of got that understanding of what they are now and is really gaining the appreciation. If there was ever a fear there of amphibian species, that's kind of gone out the door. And it's really, something that he can appreciate now. And once we provide that opportunity of understanding the audience, they are more likely to appreciate it. There's no guarantee that they'll appreciate it, but if we do a good job and help them understand, there's a really good chance that at least on some level, they can appreciate what we're trying to explain to them. And you can offer interpretation to people, but you should never try to force it, because that may result in the exact opposite effect that you are looking to achieve. And I've seen that many times, working in a visitor center, and I've probably often done it myself. When you're really passionate about something and somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, I saw this frog outside," and takes you a picture and shows you a picture of this gray tree frog that was stuck on the side of a building. And you say, "Wow, check that out. It's a gray tree frog." And you go to explain to them every single little thing there is about a gray tree frog because you absolutely are amazed. And 30 minutes later, they're trying to edge their way out the door while you're working on telling them how a gray tree frog's thumb pads work. What you have done is inflicted interpretation on your audience. They just wanted to know what a frog was. But instead, you've tried to go way too far into it. So there you kind of broke that appreciation chain and kind of drove them away and maybe made them less interested in reaching out for more information. But the most important thing that our catalyst of interpretation set off through this whole series of events was allowing the public that we are communicating with to understand the resource, appreciate the resource, and then guide them in ways that they can help us protect the resource, which is our ultimate goal. Has this person decided that they care enough about a resource to help protect that resource? And that's worded very specifically. We can't force people to care about things. It doesn't matter how much you tell someone that they need to care about a resource. They will decide if they are going to care about it and help you protect it. And back to the first part of our conversation today, when Jeff was talking about volunteers, you have to really take care with people when you're working with them and make sure that they feel appreciated, sure that they feel understood, because you have to work with them. Just like a volunteer is not going to come out, you can't force a volunteer to volunteer. Then it's not volunteering, it's conscripted labor, and that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for volunteers that are excited and enthusiastic about coming out to help us protect our resource. So for the general public, again, if we have people that have no idea about a resource and we can provide them with the understanding and the appreciation of that resource, then it may be a person who is actually damaging the resource, and we've given the opportunity to then help us out and protect the resource. So how do we do that? We need to craft a well thought out message that the public can easily accept. So the next phase of what we're going to look at here is really the development of the interpretive talk. Now, this could be a 2-day training on interpretation, what we usually do for some of our staff. But of course, we have only got about 15 minutes left. So we're going to break this down and distill it to something that hopefully you can easily grasp. And then I'll provide you with some more resources if you want to continue to expand your knowledge on interpretation. So we're going to cover the basics here and kind of give you the outline and hopefully a taste for interpretation. So there's really two types. And there's probably more than this, but the two that we're going to run into when managing natural resources are formal interpretation and informal interpretation. Formal interpretation is, I think, a lot easier than informal interpretation. Formal interpretation, we are, let's say, having a park ranger campfire program at North Park. It's about nocturnal animals. The public's welcome to come. We're going to set up, we have a pre-scripted program that's well thought out and developed. We have an outline, we have a theme, we have goals and objectives for the audience to take away. It's got a specific time and place that it's going to start. And we are going to talk for an hour about nocturnal animals. Formal interpretation, any park ranger program that you've ever been to, if you've been to one, or a formal lecture, that is very much formal interpretation. Informal interpretation is oftentimes much more difficult, but is something that we are much more likely to find ourselves involved in. As natural resource managers or people that are in parks, that's often when informal interpretation comes up. As a park ranger, I'm walking down a trail and I run into somebody in the park and they say, "Hey ranger, what's this?" Or I see them and they might be doing something they shouldn't be doing. And I'm like, "Hey, excuse me, let's talk about what you're doing, or let's talk about this." So the more informal, you're not ready for it, you may not have a scripted program for it, and you may not exactly know who this person is that you're talking to. So it can be very difficult to kind of create that bond, the understanding, the appreciation, and the provocation with that person. Much more so than when people are actively seeking you out in formal interpretation. So how do we make sure that we're ready for both of those? Being prepared for a formal interpretive experience can really make you prepared for an informal interpretive experience. So what's your message? That's the main thing you need to know. And for me, as a park ranger in the field, I have lots of different messages. My main core message is often resource conservation and how you can recreate in a park and still protect and conserve our resources. But if you have a specific message, a specific site, a specific resource that you're looking at, you need to decide what your message is. Is it preservation or conservation? Is it protection of a resource just how it is now? Or is it restoration of a resource? Are we going to improve this site? Are we going to improve this resource? Is it utilizing an area for recreation or limiting an area because we want to help keep it the way it is? Are we trying to have a call to action to get volunteers to come out and help us knock down invasive species and make an area better? Or are we trying to dissuade the public from doing something? Perhaps it's working with a homeowners group to dissuade them from planting invasive species in their gardens and encouraging them to plant native species. So knowing what your message is the most important first step that you have when developing an interpretive talk or communicating with the public. Because if you don't know what your message is, you can't communicate it. Equally important is knowing who your audience is. And again, this is a lot easier in formal interpretation than it is in informal interpretation. But there's some things you can do to help. So you need to know who your audience is. Is it a third grade class? Is it a group of older adults? Is it a mixed age group of families with mom, dad, grandparents, grandkids? Is it a group of resource management specialists? Is it a group of volunteers? You need to know who they are because your message is going to be different. I can teach a program about stream ecology to a group of adults in their 60s, to a group of children who are 6, 7, and 8 years old, to a group of resource managers, and to a group of people who have never been in a stream before. It's going to be different every time, and it's very important that it's different, because if I try to teach a group of folks like you about macroinvertebrates, or teaching a group of 5-year-olds, if I use the same program for the 5-year-olds as I use for the resource managers, it's not going to go quite so well. I'm either going to be teaching way too low or way over their head. So that's a very important thing that we need to know, is who is our audience? We need to know why they're here. What are they looking for? And we also need to know what they want from you specifically. Do they just want that quick 30-second snippet of what this frog is that they saw hanging on the outside of a wall? Or do they want something really deep involved and to get a better understanding of why something is happening in the natural environment? And we need to know what they already know. We need to make sure we know who we're talking to. So like I said, in a formal setting, it's very easy. Oftentimes, for instance, this program I've known for about a month now, or longer probably, who I'm coming to speak to and who I should be gearing my presentation to. But in the informal setting, I might be walking up to someone on the side of a trail and starting a conversation. So instead of just speaking at folks, one of the best things you can do is to ask questions. It's always important to ask questions of your audience. Get an idea of who they are, what they're interested in, what their background is. If you don't do that, you can find yourself explaining, basic biological concepts to someone who has a doctorate in biology, and you're telling them things that they already know from such a low level where you could have been speaking at a little bit of higher of a level. You might be talking to an expert and they may know way more than you do, and you're kind of not too sure about it. So we want to make sure that we never, just go off on a whim and be very sure about what our message is. But, you can ask people questions and really learn a lot about them. This format for speaking to the public is a little different for me because we're sitting here. I can't see your faces. You can't see my faces. But if we were in a room and I was doing a presentation, I'd be there much earlier than the rest of the group. I'd be waiting, a minimum, usually about 45 minutes ahead of time. And as people filter in the room, I can ask them questions. Hey, where are you from? Oh, have you been to a presentation before? What do you do? What are you interested in? Really source out my audience. That way I can change and gear my program towards them. And then the other big part is conveying our message. So we have a good message. We've researched it, we've developed it, we're ready to put it out there. We know who our audience is, or at least learned as much as we can to help make sure that message is going to get to them in the right way. We need to make sure when we convey it that we're using the right resources that we have. When we speak to people, they get about 35%, a little over a third of our message, through our verbal communication. So the words that I'm speaking to you, in my tone, my rhythm, my inflection. And about 65% of it comes from nonverbal, eye contact, gestures, your presence in the room. That includes media, imaging, audio, props. So as I'm speaking to you today, I'm using a lot of my verbal because you can't see me. If you could see me, and if you've been to a program with me before, you would realize that I talk a lot with my hands, I move around a lot, and I try to stay active. I don't want to be boring. I want to make eye contact with you. I want you to feel like I am speaking directly to you. You're the only person in the room, and I'm making sure that you understand that I'm taking care of your needs in the presentation. I'm going to use images, audio, and props that you can touch, that you can look at, that you can hear, feel, smell, that really get my message out there. I took a lot of time in my presentation today, so I hope you appreciate it and have been paying attention, but all of my images that I have been using along the way I've tried to pair them exactly with the message in that slide so that they really stand out and bring my verbal communication and my written communication together with my media. So it's a really important part of your communication. So when we're doing interpretation, one of the most important things that we can develop, and like I said, there's a lot more to interpreting and communicating with the public, but with what little time we have today, I want to make sure that I give you, I think, one of the cornerstones of an interpretive talk that you can develop and will help you in a formal presentation and with informal interpretation, and that's creating an interpretive theme. An interpretive theme is really your tagline for your presentation. So when you go and you see a movie poster hanging on the wall for a movie, it's got the tagline on the bottom that tells you what the movie is going to be about, and it captures your imagination and wants you more interested so that you go to that movie theater, pay extremely inflated prices for popcorn and some pop, and go see this movie and buy their movie tickets. And that's what I want to do with my interpretive theme. I want to grab the attention of the audience, whether I'm speaking it to them as the first line of my program or they see it on a flyer for my program. I want them to understand what my message is, why my message is important, and really just, the basis of it, what it's about, get them interested. I want them to come to my program, or I want them to stay there for the whole time. And I want to attract the widest audience as possible, especially if I'm doing informal interpretation or just speaking to the general public. Again, it's a lot easier if we know exactly what our audience is. If we have a third grade classroom we're speaking to, easy. We know how old they are. We know what their education level is. We know what we want to do. But for the general public, we want to shoot out our message as wide as possible. So I wrote an interpretive theme for you today that could go to a program that I could teach. And then I'm going to break it down a little bit and tell you about what the different parts of it are, what the different parts of my theme are, and why it's important. Hemlock trees have shaded and kept waters of Pennsylvania trout streams cool for thousands of years. But now, their existence is in peril. So this interpretive theme tells us a few different things. It provides a tangible, an intangible, and a universal concept. Tangibles are important because they are things people can touch. Hemlock trees, that's a tangible. Cool waters, tangible. Trout, tangible. People can touch those things. They know what they are. Intangibles are things like thousands of years. That's something that you can't touch, but you know what thousands of years, that's a long time. So people can appreciate that. Hemlock trees have been around for thousands of years, providing this important task of shading trout streams and keeping the waters cool. But now their existence is in peril. And existence is in peril, that phrase is a universal concept. We all know what existence is. You exist, I exist. We are here existing. And if our existence is in peril, that might mean that we have a chance of no longer existing or dying. And everyone can relate to that. We all know what existence and what non-existence means. So that's our universal concept. So that gets people interested in our topic. So if we have people that are interested in trees or water resources, they can be tied into this because they want to know more about hemlock trees, what they do to help our water resources. But at the same time, I'm throwing a line out there and I'm trying to catch those people that might not be interested in really the scientific piece of it. I might be trying to catch the angler who's out there on the stream fishing for trout, has no idea what a hemlock tree is, knows it's just another pine tree in the forest, but sees pine trees out there while they're fishing. That person might not understand why they're important or why trees, for that matter, are important and linked to the stream. But if I tell that person, hey, trout fishermen, hemlock trees provide an important source of shade to keep trout streams cool. And that angler knows trout streams need to be cool for trout to flourish. But hey, their existence is in peril. And they might say, wow, I wasn't even interested in hearing to what you had to say about trees. But now that you've connected the recreational resource that I really care about with the resource, that message that you're trying to send, they might be jumping into your program or more interested in listening to your message in that sort of more informal method. So for instance, if you saw an angler on the side of the stream who was like, hey, park ranger, all these little trees that are growing on the edge of the stream, it's really messing up my cast. It'd be great if somebody came here and cleared it out and made it a little more open. There's two responses to that. Response number one is, sorry, we can't do that. We don't change anything in our park. We don't cut down trees. They're an important part of the environment. They might say, okay, thanks, park ranger. No one cares. I'm going to come out tonight and cut them down whenever there's nobody here. That way I can cast better. But if I approach it as, well, hey, that's interesting. Let me tell you about those trees. By the way, how's the fishing going today? You caught anything? Oh, great. You've got a few trout. They're doing really good. This is a great stream. These trees actually help keep it cool. And they're facing some really big issues right now. And we can go on to talk about hemlock woolly adelgid, overbrowse from deer, and the importance of these young hemlock trees that are on this stream bank. And let them know that if we lose these trees, they might lose their recreational resource that they're so interested in. So making that connection from the intellectual to the emotional is the big premise of interpretation and how we communicate our resource management ideas to the public in a way that they understand and hopefully we can make them care about. And that's the big thing. Who cares? When I used to talk to my supervisor when I was a young interpreter at Delaware Water Gap, she'd be reviewing my interpretive programs and I'd go through it and I'd say, this is what I'm going to talk about and this is so cool and I'm really passionate about this. And at the end, every single time she would look me dead in the eye and say, who cares? And when she would say that to me, I would get super frustrated. I'm like, what do you mean, who cares? I just told you why you should care, why this is so cool and why this is important. She's like, yeah, but I know you care about it, but why should I care about it? Why should any visitor that comes to our park care about it? And that really stuck with me. So anytime that I develop a program or I'm teaching new staff how to develop interpretive programs, the most important thing I tell them to take away is, remember, it doesn't matter if you care about this. It matters who else cares. The public that you're presenting to needs to care. It doesn't matter how passionate you are about hemlock stream ecology. What matters is how passionate that angler is about hemlock stream ecology after you talk to them. So we always have to remember when speaking to the public and communicating to them, it's not about us and what we think is important. It's about making sure that when they finish speaking with us, that hopefully they think it's important too. So highlights that I want to hit that you take away from this: there's good interpretation and bad interpretation. Remember, interpretation, it inspires the audience. It makes the audience want more. It provokes them. It drives them in a way that gets them to where you want them to go, probably helping protect resources. Bad interpretation inflicts interpretation. It beats them over the head with a single narrow view of a topic that they might not care about, and you're really not making it interesting to them. It stimulates them intellectually. It gives them enough information that they want to learn more or come back and learn more from you. A big mistake interpreters can make is really providing every single little tiny detail about a topic and overwhelming people to the point where they get bored or they're not interested in it anymore. Give them enough that it stimulates them and keeps them asking for more. And probably the most important part, it connects with them emotionally. Whether it provides a positive emotional experience, an inspiring emotional experience, whether it inspires anger, maybe even a little bit of fear of the unknown, it needs to connect with them emotionally in some way. It needs to be a positive in the end. We don't want to beat somebody over the head with the idea of how ecosystems are failing and people are destroying the natural environment. We can't end on that. We have to give them that opportunity at the end to make a difference, make a change, see things in a positive light, and know that they can really go out there and do something. And that ties into our last two. It's balanced. It gives both sides. It makes sure they have the full vision of what we're talking about and allows them to make a decision on their own. Don't lack perspective. Let them see everything and make the decision. If your message is really something that's worth anything, then they should be able to make the decision that you think is the decision they should make. And it provides opportunity. It doesn't leave the experience flat. It gets that person interested in volunteering, interested in changing the way that they look and use resources to be one that helps conserve our natural resources in our parks and our open spaces. So with that, I leave you, if you want to continue learning about interpretation, which hopefully I've inspired you to do that a little bit today, and provoked you to look a little bit further, I would recommend you check out epley.org. It is the Epley Institute of Parks and Land out of Indiana University, Indiana. And they provide a ton of different trainings, from the National Park Service to the Arthur Hart Institute of Wild Resources, a variety of other trainings, everything from aquatic management to the foundations of interpretation, the interpretive talk, advanced talks on wilderness, managing visitors in wilderness, universal programming. They have just about everything, and they have a ton of free programming. So you can check that out and really expand your knowledge if you're interested in learning more about interpreting resources. It's a great place to find some free stuff. It's a great place. They have some great products you can purchase and even have online coaches in some of them products. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining me this evening. I hope you found that useful in your careers, in your everyday life. And if you have any questions for either of our presentations, we would be happy to take them at this time. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Rebecca for questions.
Okay. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but last call if there are any. Okay. Big thanks to Jeff and Braden for sharing their expertise and experience and time with us tonight. And thanks to all of you for listening. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. Please don't hesitate to reach out with questions after this closes. And I'll be sure to include the Epley link that Braden mentioned. Oh, we have a question coming in. How have you dealt with the pandemic and getting volunteers and doing interpreting?
Brayden, you want to go first, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So I think it kind of goes with the foundation of what we do as resource managers as far as an interpretation. A huge part of what we do is public programming. We do a ton of outreach programs with schools, with libraries, private groups. We do a lot of volunteering as well. So we said, we can't stop doing that as we, started going into the pandemic and realized we were going to shut down everything and people were going to be staying at home. Thankfully, the park rangers were in the field every day and working every day. We didn't miss a beat. So we were out there protecting our resources because our parks were super busy. But what we did was utilized what we had. And I think what everybody else has been doing is we brought all of our programming that we had online. So we did Zoom meetings, Teams meetings, webinars, online lectures, live programs, pre-recorded programs, and just really put it out there a couple times a week for people to see and hear. And then as soon as we were able to get people back out there in the parks, one of the fortunate things that we have is that we're outside. So we're still leading guided hikes. We have been every weekend since we opened back up into the yellow phase in June. So if you're interested in getting out there, you can check out the Allegheny County Parks page and see all of our programming that we have going on. And we're still doing online stuff, presentations like this, and for some of our groups like schools and libraries. But we've really just took full advantage and went straight into the online programming and just said, hey, this is what we got to do. We're going to do it. And don't be afraid of trying something new, I guess. That's really what I tell everybody that works with us. If you don't try it, you won't know if it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, just don't do it again. Try something else or change it. So.
And then I'll say for, the volunteer initiatives and efforts of Hollow Oak Land Trust, we watched the Allegheny County Health Department's phased reopening information very closely. And when the Allegheny County moved to the green phase, I worked with our lead land steward of Montour Woods Conservation Area, which is where we hold our Trail of Monday events. And him and I developed a plan in order to mitigate as much risk as possible. One of the, as Braden mentioned, since we do volunteer work outside, we have that benefit to our initiatives. And so our land steward and I, we developed a plan that, we required all volunteers to wear masks, even though we are outside, and I've had to turn some volunteers away who weren't happy about it because they didn't want to wear a mask. But in these current public health times, we felt that it was a necessity to wear. And we also have taken great care in planning our events and trying to get volunteer projects and initiatives for our events that promote social distancing. So, people are not working that close together. And if they are, it's for a short duration time, and that the projects that we have volunteers working on Monday evenings allow for them to be socially distant while wearing a mask. And we also encouraged volunteers to bring their own gloves and hand sanitizer and their own bottled water. Now, we had both on site. However, if we did distribute a pair of gloves to a volunteer, we told the volunteer to keep the gloves and bring them back again. So there wasn't any issues with that. So, I think it worked out pretty well. Now, as far as the types of volunteers we've been able to get, not many corporate groups have been willing to volunteer this year because most corporate employees that I'm aware of are still working from home. Uh, and this is where it goes. And the way we were able to continue our volunteer efforts is through what I mentioned for recruiting individual volunteers through our newsletters, through our Facebook outreach. And that's how we've been able to keep our volunteer initiatives going. We probably get 8 to 12 people on a Monday, and that fits perfectly within the Allegheny County uh, recommendations for events. And so we were able to safely continue our volunteer initiatives with some slight modifications.
I do have one more question for Braden, and it is when you are interpreting and someone asks you something that you can't answer, what is your go-to response?
The go-to response is, I don't know, and I will find out for you.
Great, great.
That's like I briefly touched on. You never want to get in over your head. People do it all the time. They answer questions that they think they know the answer to, and they just kind of give it an educated guess. And then there's always, especially in our field, there's always the stump the ranger person. The person that wants to ask you the question that they already know the answer to see what you say and then tell you how wrong you are. So telling someone you don't know the answer and that you can find out for them and providing your contact information or getting their contact information is absolutely the best thing to do. And you can't go wrong. You're going to get them the answer one way or the other.
That's great. We just have really nice comments here if you see them, that this is helpful in getting organized and planning programs. So thank you so much to you both. And thanks for all of you for sticking around. And we will send up some follow-up resources. So take care, everybody. Have a great night.
Take care. Thanks for having us.